Hello, Midnight Wanderers, and welcome to Netheric Horror. This is where ancient whispers rise beneath a crimson sky, carrying you softly into the world of dreams and shadows. Before tonight's haunting story begins, tell me, what corner of the world are you listening from? Drop it in the comments. And if the silence of the night calls to you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you'll never miss the moon's next dark secret. When I was 7 years old, my family moved into a new house. At first, I was excited. The house was much bigger than our previous one, and to a kid, that felt like a huge adventure. But from the moment we moved in, there was something about the place that felt off. It was an old house, the kind that carried a distinct smell that never seemed to go away no matter how much you cleaned. The wooden floors creaked, the walls seemed to groan at night, and there was always this strange feeling that lingered in the air. I couldn't explain it at the time, but even as a child, I felt uncomfortable there. The house had 4 bedrooms, including an attic room at the very top. Naturally, that was the room I wanted. At that age, an attic bedroom seemed like the coolest thing imaginable. It felt private and mysterious, almost like having my own secret hideout. My younger brother was only a year old at the time, and my mom had recently had him, so the idea of being tucked away from all the noise downstairs sounded perfect. Everyone thought I'd eventually get scared of being up there by myself. I was determined to prove them wrong. For the first few weeks, I loved having the attic room, but the excitement didn't last very long. Almost immediately, I started feeling strange whenever I was up there. The best way I can describe it is a feeling of heaviness. Not physical heaviness, more like an emotional weight hanging in the air. The room never felt comfortable. Even during the day, when sunlight poured through the window, I felt uneasy. At night, the feeling became much worse. I constantly heard noises. There would be random knocks, soft creaks, and strange sounds coming from different parts of the room. At first, I convinced myself there was a perfectly logical explanation. The house was old. Old houses make noise. The neighboring homes were attached to ours, so maybe I was hearing sounds from next door. Every explanation made sense, yet none of them ever completely reassured me. No matter how much I tried to ignore it, I always felt like someone was watching me. Whenever I sat in my room alone, I would catch myself glancing over my shoulder. I often felt like there were eyes on me. The sensation never went away. It became part of daily life. I didn't tell many people because I assumed they would laugh or tell me I was imagining things. Eventually, I got used to it, or at least I thought I did. Then something happened that I still can't explain to this day. I was around 8 or 9 years old when it happened. It was an ordinary day. Nothing unusual had happened beforehand. My mom and I were standing on the landing outside the attic stairs. The layout of the upstairs is important to understand. When you reached the top of the main staircase, there was a small landing area with a mirror on the wall. From that landing, another staircase led up to my attic bedroom. I was standing in front of the mirror, doing my hair. My mom was right beside me, using another mirror while doing her skincare routine. It was completely normal, just an ordinary moment between a mother and daughter. We were both focused on what we were doing. Then, suddenly, something caught my attention. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed movement. At almost the exact same moment, I saw my mom's expression change. Her eyes widened. That was the moment I realized she had seen it, too. Slowly, I turned my head toward the attic stairs, and that's when I saw him. A figure, the shape of a man. He appeared to be moving slowly toward my bedroom, not walking normally, almost creeping. The movement was unnerving. Everything about him looked wrong. At first, all I could really make out was a dark silhouette. The figure seemed completely black, as though it were made of shadow. Yet there were certain details that stood out. the outline of a long coat, something resembling a hat, long hair hanging around the shoulders. The shape was clear enough to recognize as a person, but too dark to identify any features. For a split second, I couldn't move. My brain struggled to understand what I was seeing. Then panic took over. My mom screamed. I screamed. The sound echoed through the house. The figure seemed to disappear almost instantly. One moment it was there. The next it wasn't. The noise brought my stepdad running upstairs. We frantically tried to explain what had happened. At first, I think he assumed we had simply startled ourselves. Still, he took it seriously enough to investigate. He immediately went upstairs to check. I remember standing there nervously while he searched. He checked my bedroom. He checked every corner, every wardrobe, every cupboard, anywhere a person could possibly hide. Several minutes later, he came back downstairs. There was nobody there. Nothing. No signs of anyone entering the house. No signs of anyone hiding upstairs. Nothing that could explain what both my mom and I had just seen. That night, there was absolutely no chance I was sleeping alone in that attic room. I refused. No amount of reassurance could change my mind. For the first time since moving into the house, I genuinely felt afraid of my bedroom. The strange thing is that after that day, my mom and I never really talked about it. Life continued. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into years. The incident slowly became one of those strange memories that sat quietly in the back of my mind. Every now and then, I would think about it. Then I'd push it aside and convince myself there had to be some rational explanation. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe our eyes had misinterpreted shadows. Maybe we had somehow influenced each other without realizing it. Years later, however, something happened that brought the memory rushing back. I was sitting in the kitchen while my mom was making dinner. We were talking about random things when somehow the subject of the old house came up. Without really thinking about it, I mentioned the figure we had seen on the landing. To my surprise, my mom immediately remembered it. Not only did she remember it, but she remembered it clearly. For the first time since it happened, we actually discussed it. As we talked, we started describing what we had seen. I expected our memories to be different. After all, years had passed. Memories change over time. Details get distorted. But that's not what happened. We both described the same figure, the same dark silhouette, the same unsettling presence, the same feeling that it had been moving toward my room. Then we started mentioning specific details. My mom remembered the long coat. I remembered the strange hat. One of us mentioned long hair. The other agreed immediately. We even remembered what looked like boots. Piece by piece, we realized we had both seen essentially the same thing. Neither of us had influenced the other's memory because we'd never discussed it before. That realization was almost more unsettling than the original experience. For years, I had assumed maybe my childhood imagination had exaggerated the event. Maybe I had created details afterward. But hearing my mom independently describe the same figure made me question everything. To this day, I don't consider myself someone who strongly believes in the paranormal. I like finding logical explanations for things. I prefer facts over ghost stories. Most strange experiences can eventually be explained if you look hard enough. Yet, this is one memory I have never managed to explain. Maybe there was a perfectly rational reason for what we saw. Maybe our brains interpreted shadows in the exact same way at the exact same moment. Maybe there was some visual illusion neither of us understood. I honestly don't know. What I do know is that both my mom and I saw something that day. We both reacted instantly. We both screamed. And years later, We both remembered the same dark figure standing near the stairs leading to my attic bedroom. The older I get, the less I think about ghosts and hauntings. But every once in a while, I remember that afternoon. I remember standing beside my mom in front of the mirror. I remember seeing movement out of the corner of my eye. And I remember turning my head to find a shadowy man slowly making his way toward my room. Whether it was paranormal or not, it's a memory that still gives me chills. And even now, after all these years, I sometimes find myself wondering what exactly we saw that day. This happened not long after my family moved into a new house. Everything was still unfamiliar to us. The rooms felt different, the sounds were different, and even though it was supposed to be our home, it still felt strange at night. In our family, I was usually the last person awake. Because of that, it became my responsibility to make sure all the doors were locked before going to bed. Nobody else really paid attention to it, so every night I would walk through the house and check each door one by one. One night, everything seemed normal. The house was quiet, and everyone else was already asleep. I was doing my usual routine before bed, making sure everything was secure. After checking the front of the house, I headed toward the back door to lock it. The back door was near the laundry area where the dryer was. I remember feeling completely normal as I walked over there. There was nothing unusual about the night. I locked the door and turned around. As I looked toward the dryer, I froze. Standing there was a woman. She had long black hair and was wearing a white dress. What terrified me the most was the expression on her face. She was smiling directly at me. For a moment, I couldn't move. My heart felt like it had stopped. I just stared at her, trying to understand what I was seeing. Everything around me suddenly felt cold and unreal. Then I quickly turned my head away. It was only for a second. When I looked back, there was nothing there. The woman was gone. The space beside the dryer was completely empty. I stood there in shock, trying to convince myself that maybe I had imagined it. Maybe I was tired. Maybe it was a shadow. Maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew what I had seen. Panic rushed through my body. Without wasting another second, I switched off the light and ran as fast as I could. I didn't look behind me. I didn't want to see anything else. I rushed into the living room and jumped onto the side of the couch where I usually slept. My heart was pounding so hard that I could hear it in my ears. I pulled out my phone and immediately called my friend. When she answered, I told her everything. I explained what I had seen and how scared I was. Even saying it out loud made me feel nervous. My friend listened and tried to calm me down. She told me she would stay on the phone with me until I fell asleep. I remember replying, "What do you mean until I fall asleep? I'm not going to sleep." At that moment, sleeping felt impossible. Every shadow in the room looked suspicious. Every little sound made me jump. I kept thinking about that woman standing near the dryer and smiling at me. The image wouldn't leave my mind. As I sat there feeling terrified, my dad woke up to use the bathroom. When I saw him, I immediately told him what had happened. I expected him to laugh it off or tell me that I was imagining things. But he didn't. He listened carefully. Then he told me that he believed me. Out of everyone in the house, he was the only one who did. What surprised me even more was the reason why. He told me that something similar had happened to him and his sister years before. Because of his own experience, he didn't dismiss what I was saying. He understood why I was frightened. Knowing that my dad believed me made me feel a little better. The fear didn't disappear, but at least I didn't feel completely alone. For a long time after that night, I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen. Whenever I walked past the laundry area, I remembered that smiling woman in the white dress. Even during the daytime, the memory would come back to me. Every time the house was quiet at night, I found myself looking over my shoulder. I would remember standing by that back door and seeing something that I still couldn't explain. Years have passed since then, but that memory remains one of the clearest and most frightening experiences of my life. What makes the story even more emotional for me now is that my dad is no longer here. Back then, whenever something strange happened, I knew I could tell him. I knew he would listen. I knew he wouldn't immediately say I was making it up. He understood because he had experienced something similar himself. Now, if something like that ever happens again, I would probably have to tell my mom. The problem is that I don't think she would believe me. She has always been more skeptical about things like that. She would most likely try to find a logical explanation, and maybe that's understandable. But sometimes I think about how comforting it was to have at least one person who trusted what I was saying. When my dad was alive, I never had to wonder whether someone would believe me. He always listened. Losing him was already difficult, but moments like this make me miss him even more. Sometimes it isn't just about the scary experience itself. It's about having someone who understands how you feel afterward. To this day, I still don't know exactly what I saw near that dryer. Maybe there is an explanation. Maybe there isn't. All I know is that I will never forget the sight of that woman with black hair, dressed in white, smiling at me from across the room. And I will never forget how terrified I felt when I turned back and realized she had completely disappeared. But more than that, I will never forget the comfort of having my dad believe me when nobody else did. That part of the memory has stayed with me just as strongly as the frightening image itself. Whenever I think about that night, I remember both things together. The fear of what I saw and the reassurance of knowing that someone I trusted was willing to listen. Now that he's gone, that memory means even more to me. It reminds me of the kind of person he was and how much his support mattered during moments when I felt scared and alone, whether what I saw was real or not. One thing is certain. It was an experience that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. The neighborhood where I grew up sat right beside a college campus. It was one of the things I loved most about living there. The campus was large, quiet, and surrounded by thick woods that stretched for what felt like miles. During the day, it was beautiful. People walked their dogs along the trails, students sat outside studying, and families would stroll through the wooded paths. Because it was so close to our house, my friends and I spent a lot of time there. Sometimes we would walk around after school, and other times we would just hang out and talk for hours. Even though the campus was beautiful during the day, it felt completely different at night. The woods seemed darker than they should have been. The trails that looked peaceful in the sunlight became unsettling after sunset. Every shadow seemed deeper, and every sound carried farther through the trees. There was one particular area of the campus that had always made me uncomfortable, even before the night this story took place. When I was 16 years old, a friend and I had spent the evening driving around town. We didn't really have anywhere specific to go. Like most teenagers, we were just looking for something to do. Eventually, we started talking about scary stories and creepy experiences. Before long, we had convinced ourselves that it would be fun to scare each other. That decision led us to the campus. The area we chose was extremely close to my house. In fact, I could have easily walked there in just a few minutes. Since we had already been driving around, though, we decided to park and explore on foot. To understand what happened, it helps to picture the layout of the area. There were two parking lots connected by a network of trails. The first parking lot sat deeper within the woods. It was larger and much more isolated. This was where we parked the car. From that lot, a narrow dirt trail wound through dense forest for about a quarter of a mile. The trees on both sides grew so thick that they blocked out most of the moonlight. At the end of that trail, it connected to a short paved pathway that cut across the side of a hill. On one side of the path, the ground sloped upward toward several campus buildings. These were mostly offices and administrative buildings that sat empty at night. On the opposite side, the hill dropped toward another tree line. That tree line always bothered me. I could never fully explain why. Part of it was because of something strange that had happened several times over the years. On more than one occasion, I had found dead deer lying just beyond those trees. Looking back, there was probably a perfectly normal explanation. Wild animals die in the woods all the time. Predators exist. Nature is often unpleasant. Still, something about seeing those deer there repeatedly left a lasting impression on me. Every time I passed that section of woods, I felt uneasy. The paved path itself wasn't very long. It stretched only a couple hundred feet before reaching the second parking lot. That parking lot sat directly across the street from my house. On the night everything happened, the campus was almost completely dark. Clouds covered most of the sky, and there were very few lights nearby. The only illumination came from our phone flashlights as we walked along the trail. At first, we were having fun. We took turns trying to scare each other. One of us would suddenly gasp and point into the trees. The other would jump and spin around, expecting to see something lurking in the darkness. Sometimes, we would sneak up behind one another or whisper creepy stories. I am naturally easy to scare, so it didn't take much for my nerves to start building. By the time we reached the paved pathway, I was already feeling anxious. Every rustle of leaves made me glance over my shoulder. Every movement in the darkness seemed suspicious. Then something happened that instantly changed the mood. Out of nowhere, a man appeared on the path ahead of us. At first glance, there was nothing obviously wrong about him. He looked like an ordinary person. But the more I looked at him, the more uncomfortable I became. He was dressed in an expensive-looking suit and tie, which immediately seemed strange considering where we were. It was late at night, deep within a wooded college campus. Most people in that area wore casual clothes, especially after dark. Yet this man looked as if he had just stepped out of a business meeting. Then there was the way he walked. Even now, years later, it is difficult to describe. His movements didn't look natural. They reminded me of the way action figures move in old television shows. Every step appeared stiff and awkward, almost mechanical. But the thing I remember most clearly was his smile. It wasn't a friendly smile. It wasn't the kind of smile someone gives while passing strangers on a trail. It was huge, an unnaturally wide grin that exposed nearly all of his teeth. The smile never seemed to change. As we approached him, both my friend and I became noticeably uncomfortable. Still, we tried to stay rational. After all, it wasn't impossible that someone would be walking around campus at night. Students frequently wandered through the area. Some people camped in the woods. Others used the trails after dark. Seeing another person wasn't unusual. So we continued walking. As we passed him, he turned his head slightly toward us. He nodded politely. Then he said hello. His voice sounded normal. That somehow made everything even stranger. We awkwardly returned the greeting and continued walking. After passing him, we started quietly laughing to ourselves. Not because anything was funny, but because we felt nervous. We were trying to convince ourselves that we were overreacting. Maybe he was just a weird guy. Maybe he was a professor. Maybe he was someone heading home after an event. We kept walking. Then, around 20 seconds later, something made me look back. The moment I turned around, my stomach dropped. The man had stopped walking. He was standing perfectly still in the middle of the path, and he was facing us. Even from a distance, I could tell he was watching us. I immediately whispered to my friend. She turned around, too. The second she saw him, her expression changed. Without saying much, we began walking faster. Neither of us wanted to admit how frightened we were becoming. A few seconds later, we looked back again. The man had raised one arm. He was motioning toward us, slowly waving his hand, beckoning, inviting us to come back. Neither of us responded. We simply stared. He didn't call out. He didn't speak. He didn't explain why he wanted our attention. He just continued standing there, silently waving. Over the years, I have tried countless times to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe we dropped something. Maybe he was trying to return an item. Maybe he was lost and wanted directions. Maybe he needed help. But if that was the case, why didn't he say anything? Why didn't he simply call out to us? Why stand there silently waving from the darkness? Even now, none of those explanations feel right. At that point, fear had completely taken over. We didn't run. Not yet. Instead, we walked as quickly as possible while trying to remain calm. We kept telling ourselves that there had to be a reasonable explanation. There had to be. When we finally reached the more open section of the paved pathway, we looked behind us again. The man was gone. There was no sign of him anywhere. That should have made us feel better. Instead, it somehow made things worse. Now we had no idea where he was. We continued toward the second parking lot, glancing over our shoulders every few seconds. Neither of us wanted to walk back through the wooded trail to get to the car. The thought of returning through those trees felt impossible. Instead, we decided we would go to my house first and retrieve the car in the morning. As we hurried toward the parking lot near my home, neither of us said much. The atmosphere felt heavy. The fear was becoming difficult to ignore. Then something happened that I will never forget. We were roughly halfway down the paved path when I happened to glance down the hill toward the tree line. The same tree line that had always made me uncomfortable. The second I looked, I froze. Standing among the darkness was a figure, a human-shaped silhouette. Because of the lack of light, I couldn't make out any details. I couldn't see a face. I couldn't see clothing. I couldn't even tell exactly how far away it was. All I could see was the shape of a person standing perfectly still at the edge of the woods. For a moment, neither of us moved. The figure slowly lifted one arm. Then, it made the exact same gesture. It beckoned toward us, inviting us to come closer. That was enough. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave. We turned and ran. Not jogged, not hurried. Ran, we sprinted through the parking lot as fast as we possibly could. We crossed the street and rushed into my house. The second we got inside, we locked every door. We checked every window. Then we stayed in my room for the rest of the night. Neither of us slept much. Every sound outside made us jump. Every shadow in the room seemed threatening. The next morning, we talked about what had happened. What struck me most was that our memories matched perfectly. Every detail. The man in the suit. The smile. The strange walk. The silent waving. The figure at the tree line. We both remembered it exactly the same way. We tried to make sense of it. The most logical explanation was that the figure near the woods had been the same man we encountered on the trail. But there was a problem. There was no possible way he could have gotten there. To reach that location, He would have needed to move through dense forests at an impossible speed. And yet, both of us were convinced it was him. When we told my parents, they dismissed the story immediately. They said we were exaggerating. They said we had scared ourselves. They said our imaginations had taken over. Part of me wished they were right. Unfortunately, there was one final detail. Later that morning, we returned to retrieve my car from the parking lot. At first, everything seemed normal. Then I noticed something near the vehicle. Large footprints. Human footprints. They surrounded the back of the car. They continued along the driver's side. Then they moved toward the front. The prints appeared unusually large and deep. I couldn't explain them. Neither could my friend. We didn't stay long enough to investigate. The moment we saw them, we got back into the car and left. To this day, nobody believes our story. Everyone assumes we imagined it. Everyone assumes we scared ourselves. But the memory has never faded. What stays with me most isn't the footprints or even the strange man. It's the feeling, the overwhelming sense of dread that washed over me when I looked toward the tree line and saw that dark figure silently beckoning us into the woods. I have experienced fear many times since then, but I have never experienced anything that felt quite like that. And no matter how many years pass, I don't think I will ever forget it. I work in the trades, primarily installing flooring. Most of the projects I take on are remodels, which means the homeowners are usually still living in the house while we're working. Because of that, I'm used to having customers around throughout the day. Some people stay out of the way, while others like to watch every step of the process. After years in the industry, none of that bothers me anymore. If a homeowner wants to stand there and observe, that's their house and their right. I've also never been someone who believes in ghosts, spirits, or anything supernatural. I've always considered myself a practical person. I like explanations that make sense. If something strange happens, I usually assume there's a logical reason behind it, even if I don't immediately understand what it is. That being said, I do think there are certain experiences that leave you with more questions than answers. This happened during what started as a completely ordinary job. My brother and I had been hired to install new flooring in a customer's home. The house itself wasn't particularly old or rundown. It looked well maintained and lived in. The homeowners were friendly enough, and nothing seemed unusual when we first arrived. As we worked throughout the morning, I started noticing that the house contained a lot of decorative items. There were small statues, artwork, collectibles, and various pieces displayed throughout different rooms. Some of it looked modern, while other pieces appeared older and more traditional. It wasn't the kind of decor I would choose for my own home, but there was certainly nothing wrong with it. One particular item caught my attention. At the end of a hallway, there was a shelf mounted against the wall. Several objects sat on the shelf, but one stood out more than the others. It looked like a small statue, possibly a Buddha face or something similar. It wasn't very large, maybe 5 or 6 inches across, but it was noticeable because of where it was positioned. The shelf sat at the far end of the hallway, and throughout the day I found myself walking past it repeatedly while carrying tools, measuring rooms, and moving materials from one area of the house to another. At first I didn't think much about it. Then something strange started happening. Every time I passed that hallway, I would catch what looked like a tall figure standing near the end of it. The figure always appeared in my peripheral vision. It looked human, not just human-sized either. It appeared to be around 6 feet tall, standing perfectly still near the shelf. The first few times I noticed it, I didn't react at all. In fact, I assumed it was the homeowner. As I mentioned, I'm used to customers watching me work. Sometimes they'll stand quietly in another room or hallway while observing the progress. It's incredibly common in this line of work. So when I caught sight of what looked like a tall person standing there, my brain immediately categorized it as a homeowner checking on the project. I barely gave it a second thought. I would walk past, assume someone was standing there, and continue working. As the day went on, though, something began to feel off. For one thing, every time I tried to get a better look at the figure, it disappeared. I don't mean it walked away. I mean it simply wasn't there. I would catch sight of it from the corner of my eye, turn my head to look directly at it, and suddenly the hallway would be empty. At first, I laughed it off. Peripheral vision can be strange. People see movement all the time that turns out to be nothing. I figured it was some combination of shadows, lighting, and the placement of the statue. Still, it kept happening every single time I walked by. Out of the corner of my eye, there was a tall figure standing near the shelf. The moment I looked directly at it, nothing, just an empty hallway. After a while, I started paying closer attention. Instead of ignoring it, I intentionally looked toward the hallway whenever I passed. The weird thing was that I could almost predict when it would happen. As soon as I reached a certain point, there it was again. A dark silhouette standing motionless at the end of the hall. And every single time I focused on it, the figure vanished. Eventually, I began wondering where the homeowner actually was. I realized that I hadn't seen them anywhere near that part of the house for quite some time. The figure couldn't be them. The more I thought about it, the less sense it made. At one point, I specifically checked nearby rooms to see if someone was moving around and creating unusual shadows. Nothing. The hallway remained empty. Yet somehow, every time I passed, I still saw the same shape. A tall, dark figure standing at the end of the hall. I tried to come up with explanations. Maybe the statue was creating some kind of visual illusion. Maybe the shape of the face, combined with the surrounding decorations, was tricking my brain into recognizing a human form. Humans are naturally wired to identify faces and bodies, even when they aren't actually there. I've heard about people seeing shapes in clouds or faces in random objects. Maybe this was the same thing. That explanation made sense. At least it did until my brother mentioned it. We had been working quietly for most of the day when he casually brought up something strange. He asked if I had noticed someone standing in the hallway. The question immediately got my attention. I asked him what he meant. Then he described exactly what I had been seeing. A tall, shadow-like figure standing near the shelf, visible only for a moment, gone whenever you tried to look directly at it. The moment he finished speaking, I felt a chill run through me. Up until then, I had convinced myself that my brain was simply playing tricks on me. But hearing someone else describe the exact same thing made me uncomfortable. I didn't tell him immediately how much it had been bothering me. Instead, I asked a few questions. I wanted to make sure we were talking about the same thing. Unfortunately, we were. The details matched. Neither of us could explain it. Now, there are still plenty of logical possibilities. Maybe the lighting in the house created the same visual illusion for both of us. Maybe the placement of the statue triggered some subconscious pattern recognition. Maybe there was a reflection from a nearby window that neither of us noticed. I honestly don't know. What I do know is that the atmosphere of the house felt different after that conversation. Before then, I had simply been working. Afterward, I became increasingly aware of how uneasy I felt. It wasn't overwhelming fear. It wasn't panic. It was more like a constant feeling that something wasn't quite right. The house suddenly felt heavier somehow. Every room seemed quieter. The hallway became a place I preferred not to look toward. I found myself wanting to finish the project as quickly as possible. Every time I carried materials through the house, I expected to see that figure again. And most of the time, I did. Always in the corner of my eye. Always standing in the same general area. Always gone the second I focused on it. By late afternoon, neither my brother nor I were spending much time discussing it. In some ways, talking about it made it feel more real. Instead, we focused on finishing the job. We measured, cut, installed, cleaned up, and packed our equipment. The entire time, though, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Again, that's not unusual in my line of work. Customers watch contractors all the time. The difference was that this feeling didn't seem connected to any actual person. It felt like the sensation lingered even when I knew nobody was there. When we finally loaded our tools and prepared to leave, I felt relieved. As soon as we stepped outside, the strange feeling began to fade. The fresh air helped. The normal sounds of the neighborhood helped. Within minutes, everything seemed ordinary again. Yet the experience stayed with me. I've thought about it many times since then. Part of me still believes there must be a simple explanation. Maybe the statue created a visual effect from certain angles. Maybe both of our brains interpreted the same shapes in the same way. Maybe there was something about the lighting conditions that neither of us consciously noticed. All of those explanations are possible. In fact, they're probably more likely than anything supernatural. But even with those possibilities in mind, I can't fully explain why the experience felt so unsettling. The visual illusion itself wasn't what bothered me most. What bothered me was the fact that my brother experienced it too. Neither of us mentioned it until later in the day. Neither of us influenced the other's perception beforehand. Yet somehow we both ended up noticing the exact same thing. Maybe that's just coincidence. Maybe it's psychology. Maybe it's something else entirely. I honestly don't know. What I do know is that out of all the houses I've worked in over the years, that one remains the only place where I consistently felt like there was someone standing just out of sight. And even though I still don't believe in ghosts, I can't deny that whenever I think back to that hallway, that small statue, and the dark figure that seemed to appear whenever I looked away, I still get the same uneasy feeling I had on the day it happened. Some experiences leave you with answers. Others leave you with questions. This one has stayed a question ever since. When I was in 5th grade, I experienced something that still confuses me to this day. Looking back, there are probably logical explanations for what happened, but at the time, it felt like I had seen something impossible. It was an ordinary school day, and nothing unusual had happened that morning. Classes were moving along as usual, and when lunchtime finally arrived, most of the students rushed out of the classroom to eat, talk with friends, or spend time outside before the next lesson started. I decided to walk to a nearby convenience store to buy something to eat. It wasn't far from the school, and a lot of students would go there during lunch breaks. Before leaving the classroom, I glanced around the room and noticed one of my classmates sitting near the back. Let's call him Frank. Frank was sitting alone and looking down at his phone. He seemed completely focused on whatever he was doing. The glow of the screen reflected faintly on his face, and he barely looked up as students passed by him. I didn't think much of it. Frank was usually pretty quiet, and seeing him sitting alone wasn't unusual. I simply noticed him, then continued on my way to the store. The walk there was normal. I bought some snacks and a drink, paid for everything, and started heading back to school. The entire trip probably took no more than 10 or 15 minutes. When I returned to the classroom, something immediately caught my attention. Frank was still sitting in exactly the same place. At first, that didn't seem particularly strange. Then I noticed something odd. He appeared to be sitting in the exact same position as before. His head was tilted down at the same angle. His arms were in the same position. Even the way he was holding the phone looked identical. For a moment, I found it amusing. I walked over and laughed. "Why are you still sitting here using your phone?" I asked. "It looks like you haven't moved at all." I expected him to respond with some sarcastic comment, or at least look up. Instead, he said nothing, not a single word. He didn't even react. He continued staring at the phone as if I wasn't there. That seemed a little rude, but I didn't think much of it. Maybe he was concentrating on something. Maybe he had headphones in. Maybe he simply didn't hear me. Whatever the reason, I wasn't interested enough to press the issue. I shrugged, sat down, and started eating the food I had bought. A few minutes later, I decided to walk over and talk to one of my friends who was outside. As I approached the school courtyard, I noticed a familiar face among a small group of students. My stomach instantly tightened. It was Frank. At least it looked exactly like Frank. For a second, I thought I was mistaken. I blinked and looked again. No, it was definitely him. The same hair, the same face, the same school uniform, the same classmate I had supposedly seen sitting inside the classroom moments earlier. I stared at him in complete confusion. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing. How could he be outside? I had just seen him inside. Not only that, but I had spoken to him. I had been close enough to clearly see his face. Trying to make sense of it, I quickly walked over. "Frank," I called. He turned toward me. Immediately, I could tell something was different. Unlike the person sitting in the classroom, this Frank looked fully engaged and aware of his surroundings. I pointed toward the school building. "Weren't you just inside using your phone?" I asked. The look on his face changed instantly. He seemed genuinely confused. "Huh?" he replied. I laughed nervously. "You were sitting in the classroom. I literally saw you a few minutes ago." Frank frowned. "What are you talking about?" The confusion in his voice sounded completely genuine. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then he shook his head. "I've been outside this whole time." I stared at him. "What?" "I've been with my brother during lunch," he said. "I haven't been inside." I felt a strange chill run through my body. That answer made no sense. I knew what I had seen. I had seen him sitting in the classroom. I had walked right past him. I had spoken to him. I remembered it clearly. Trying to find a reasonable explanation, I asked another question. "Then where's your phone?" Frank looked even more confused. "My phone?" "Yeah, you were looking at it." He laughed. "I didn't even bring my phone today." The moment he said that, all the color seemed to drain from my face. I remember standing there completely frozen. Everything suddenly felt wrong. If Frank had been outside the entire time, then who had I seen sitting in the classroom? Maybe I had mistaken someone else for him. That was the most logical explanation. But the more I thought about it, the less likely it seemed. I knew my classmates well. We spent every day together. The person in the classroom hadn't just looked similar to Frank. He looked exactly like him. The same face, the same hairstyle, the same build. Everything, even stranger. The person never responded when I spoke. He didn't look up. He didn't acknowledge me. He simply continued staring at the phone. The memory became more unsettling the longer I thought about it. The rest of the day, I found myself repeatedly glancing around the classroom. Part of me expected to see that silent figure sitting there again. Of course, I never did. When classes ended, I couldn't stop replaying the experience in my mind. I tried to convince myself that I had simply made a mistake. People misidentify others all the time. Maybe another student happened to resemble Frank from a distance. Maybe I wasn't paying close attention. Maybe my memory was exaggerating details after the fact. But even now, years later, that explanation doesn't fully satisfy me. What bothers me most isn't that I thought I saw someone who looked like Frank. What bothers me is how certain I felt at the time. I wasn't casually glancing across a crowded room. I had walked into the classroom, noticed him immediately, and even spoken directly to him. The image remains incredibly clear in my memory. Then, only a few minutes later, I found the real Frank outside, acting completely confused about what I was talking about. To this day, I have never been able to explain it. Maybe there was a perfectly normal reason. Maybe another student happened to look identical to him. Maybe my memory isn't as reliable as I believe. Or maybe it was one of those strange moments in life that never receives a proper explanation. All I know is that for a brief moment in 5th grade, it felt like my classmate was somehow in two places at once. And the image of that silent boy sitting motionless in the classroom, staring down at a phone he supposedly never even brought to school, is something I have never completely forgotten. A few years ago, a group of friends and I decided to rent a large cabin through Airbnb for a long weekend getaway. There were 5 or 6 of us all together, and we wanted somewhere quiet where we could relax, play games, watch movies, and get away from the noise of everyday life. We ended up finding a huge cabin deep in the woods. It looked amazing in the photos, surrounded by trees with a beautiful view of the forest and plenty of space for everyone. When we arrived, the place was even bigger than we expected. The cabin had multiple bedrooms, a large living area, a kitchen, and a massive game room located near one end of the building. The game room had a pool table, a television, comfortable couches, and enough floor space for several people to sleep. Since there were 3 of us who didn't mind sharing a larger room, my 2 friends and I decided to sleep there for the duration of the trip. The first day was great. We spent most of our time exploring the property, playing games, cooking food, and enjoying being away from home. The cabin was surrounded by woods in every direction. During the daytime, the scenery was beautiful. Snow lightly covered parts of the ground, and the trees stretched endlessly into the distance. Everything felt peaceful and isolated in the best possible way. As evening approached, the atmosphere naturally changed. The woods that had looked inviting during the day became dark and mysterious at night. Looking out the windows after sunset felt completely different. Beyond the reach of the outdoor lights was nothing but darkness and countless trees. Still, none of us thought much about it. The first night passed without incident. The second day was just as enjoyable. We spent hours in the game room, joked around, and stayed up much later than we probably should have. By the time everyone finally went to bed, I was exhausted. Sometime during the night, I suddenly woke up. At first, I wasn't entirely sure why. Then I realized I was incredibly thirsty. That wasn't unusual for me. I've always had a habit of waking up in the middle of the night, needing a drink of water. Normally, I would simply get up, head to the kitchen, grab some water, and go back to sleep. That's exactly what I planned to do. The room was completely dark. The game room had no lights on, and the only faint illumination came from whatever moonlight managed to make its way through the windows. My friends were asleep nearby, and the room was silent except for the occasional sound of someone shifting in their sleep. I checked my phone briefly. It was around 2 in the morning, the kind of hour when everything feels quieter than usual. I got up carefully, trying not to wake anyone. The floor creaked beneath my feet as I crossed the room. I opened the game room door and stepped into the hallway. Immediately, I noticed how dark the cabin felt. During the day, the hallways seemed warm and welcoming. At 2 in the morning, they felt completely different. Every doorway looked like a black opening leading into another layer of darkness. I started walking toward the kitchen. The route was simple. I had already made the trip countless times during our stay. There was no reason to feel nervous. Yet for some reason, I felt slightly uneasy. Maybe it was because everyone else was asleep. Maybe it was because of the darkness. Or maybe it was simply because being alone in a large cabin surrounded by miles of forest can make anyone feel vulnerable. As I continued down the hallway, I approached one of the most noticeable features of the cabin, a massive glass door. The door looked out directly into the forest. During the daytime, it offered a beautiful view of the trees and snow-covered landscape. At night, however, it became something else entirely. Instead of showing a peaceful forest, it became a giant black mirror framed by darkness. As I reached the end of the hallway, I casually glanced toward the glass. I wasn't expecting to see anything. I certainly wasn't looking for anything. It was just a quick glance. Then, I saw it. Even now, years later, I struggle to describe exactly what I witnessed. I don't know if it was a figure. I don't know if it was a shadow. I don't know if it was a trick of the darkness. All I know is that there was something there, standing beyond the glass. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was looking at. The shape seemed darker than the darkness surrounding it. It appeared separate from the trees, separate from the shadows, almost like a silhouette standing among the snow and forest. The strangest part wasn't what I saw. The strangest part was what happened the moment I saw it. An overwhelming wave of dizziness hit me instantly. It wasn't gradual. It wasn't the kind of dizziness you get from standing up too quickly. It happened the exact second my eyes landed on whatever was outside. One moment I was walking normally. The next, the world seemed to tilt beneath me. My balance disappeared. I stumbled and had to catch myself. Everything around me suddenly felt disoriented. My vision blurred. I remember squinting, desperately trying to focus. For a brief moment, I wondered if I was about to pass out. The sensation was so strong and so sudden that it genuinely frightened me. I tried to look again. I wanted to figure out what I had seen. But the harder I tried to focus, the more confused I became. The darkness outside seemed impossible to make sense of. Part of me wanted to walk closer to the glass. Another part of me wanted absolutely nothing to do with it. A deep sense of fear settled over me. Not panic, not terror, just an overwhelming feeling that I should not continue looking, that I should leave immediately. I stood there for what was probably only a few seconds, though it felt much longer. The cabin remained silent. Nothing moved outside. Nothing made a sound. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Suddenly, getting a glass of water seemed completely unimportant. In fact, I forgot about it entirely. My original reason for getting out of bed vanished from my mind. All I wanted to do was get away from that hallway. I turned around and walked back toward the game room. My heart was beating faster than before. I kept resisting the urge to look over my shoulder. The closer I got to the room, the safer I felt. When I finally stepped inside, I immediately went over to my girlfriend. At the time, she was sleeping in another area of the cabin. I gently woke her up. She was understandably exhausted and confused. I remember trying to explain what had happened. I told her that I had seen something outside. I told her about the dizziness. I told her how strange it felt. She listened despite being half asleep. To her credit, she stayed awake with me for a while. We sat there talking quietly in the darkness. Having another person awake helped calm me down. The cabin felt less threatening. The hallway seemed farther away. Eventually, the feeling of panic faded enough that I was able to relax. I never did get that glass of water. The idea of walking back down that hallway simply wasn't worth it. For the rest of the trip, I made sure to keep a bottle of water next to where I slept. Every night before bed, I checked to make sure it was within reach. I had no interest in making another late-night journey through the cabin. The remaining nights passed without incident. Nothing else happened. I never saw the figure again. I never experienced that sudden dizziness again either. Yet the memory stayed with me. Years have passed since that trip, and I still think about it occasionally. I've tried to come up with explanations. Maybe I was still half asleep. Maybe the darkness caused my eyes to misinterpret shapes among the trees. Maybe standing up too quickly triggered the dizziness, and my brain simply connected the sensation to whatever I happened to be looking at. Those explanations are possible. In fact, they're probably the most logical answers. But what makes the experience difficult to forget is how immediate everything felt. The dizziness happened the exact instant I noticed the shape outside. The timing was so precise that it has always stuck with me. Even today, I can still picture that moment. The dark hallway, the silent cabin, the snow-covered woods beyond the glass, and that strange shape standing somewhere out there in the darkness. Whether it was real, imagined, or simply a trick of the night, I honestly don't know. What I do know is that I've stayed in plenty of cabins since then, and I've spent countless nights in remote places without a second thought. Yet whenever I wake up thirsty in the middle of the night and have to walk through a dark house, part of my mind always drifts back to that cabin in the woods. I remember standing in that hallway at 2 a.m, looking through the glass into the darkness. And I remember the overwhelming feeling that something was looking back. To this day, that memory still gives me chills. When I was a child, my parents and I lived in an incredibly old house. I don't mean the kind of house that's just a few decades old and needs a little renovation. This place felt ancient. The floors creaked with almost every step. The walls seemed to hold decades of stories, and there was always a strange atmosphere that I couldn't quite explain. Adding to the mystery was something I had heard from relatives and neighbors over the years. Apparently, someone had died in the house a very long time ago. Nobody seemed to know all the details. And because I was young, I probably imagined parts of the story being scarier than they really were. Still, once you hear something like that as a kid, it sticks in your mind. Every strange noise suddenly feels important. Every shadow becomes suspicious. Every creak of the floorboard sounds like someone walking around when nobody should be there. Despite the age of the house and all the stories surrounding it, life there was mostly normal. One of my favorite memories from that time was spending evenings with my dad. We had a habit of sitting together on the couch and watching television. It was one of those simple routines that you don't fully appreciate until years later. No matter what was going on in life, there was something comforting about ending the day sitting beside him and watching our favorite shows. One evening, we were doing exactly that. We were sitting in the living room watching episodes of Brooklyn Nine-Nine, laughing at the jokes and enjoying a quiet night together. My mom wasn't home. In fact, as far as I remember, it was just my dad and me in the entire house. The evening felt completely ordinary. Nothing seemed unusual. Nothing seemed out of place. Then, everything changed in an instant. One moment, my dad was relaxed on the couch. The next moment, he shot to his feet so quickly that it startled me. I immediately stopped paying attention to the television. His reaction was unlike anything I had ever seen. The muscles in his arms and shoulders tensed instantly. His entire posture changed. It was the kind of reaction someone has when they suddenly see something alarming. Not surprising. Not confusing. Alarming, the expression on his face made my stomach drop. He looked genuinely disturbed. As a child, seeing a parent frightened is a very unsettling experience. Parents are supposed to be the calm ones. They're supposed to be the people who know what's going on. When they suddenly look scared, it makes you feel vulnerable. I sat up on the couch and followed his gaze. My dad wasn't looking at the television. He wasn't looking out a window. He was staring toward the corner of the room. Our living room had two doorways positioned close together. One doorway led into the kitchen. The other led into a hallway that connected to the staircase leading upstairs. The staircase itself had a sharp turn and was fairly steep. Anyone walking up or down it usually couldn't be seen immediately because of the angle. My dad was staring directly at the hallway entrance. For a second, nobody moved. Then he started walking toward it, not casually, not curiously, purposefully, like someone who thought there was a serious problem. I remember feeling confused as I watched him approach the doorway. At first, I assumed he had heard something, maybe a noise from upstairs, maybe someone knocking on a window, maybe something had fallen. But the closer he got to the hallway, the stranger his behavior became. He started looking around aggressively, checking the hallway, looking toward the staircase, peering around corners. His head moved quickly from one direction to another. Then he started shouting. I don't remember his exact words anymore. Too many years have passed. But I remember the tone. It wasn't casual conversation. It wasn't calling for someone in another room. It sounded like he was confronting someone, as if he expected another person to be standing there, as if he believed somebody was hiding in the house. At that point, I became scared too. The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. The television was still playing in the background, but neither of us were paying attention anymore. All I could focus on was my dad's reaction. He continued checking the hallway and stairs for a while. Then eventually, he came back. Whatever he thought he had seen was gone. The rest of the evening felt strange. Even though things eventually returned to normal, I couldn't stop wondering what had happened. But every time I thought about asking him, I forgot. Or maybe I didn't really want to know. A few days later, I went to stay at my grandmother's house. Like many kids, I loved spending time there. It was a nice break from home, and I wasn't thinking about the strange incident anymore. After a couple of days, I returned home. The memory came back almost immediately. I finally decided to ask my dad about it. At the time, I expected a simple explanation. Maybe he had seen a shadow. Maybe he thought he heard a noise. Maybe it had been nothing. So one day, I casually brought it up. Do you remember that night when you suddenly jumped up while we were watching TV? He immediately knew what I was talking about. Then he gave me an answer I wasn't expecting. I saw someone looking at me from the doorway. For a second, I genuinely thought I had misunderstood him. Someone? What did he mean, someone? I asked him to explain. The more he described it, the more uncomfortable I became. According to him, he hadn't seen a shadow. He hadn't seen a strange light. He hadn't seen something transparent or ghost-like. He believed he had seen an actual person, a full person, standing in the hallway doorway, looking directly at him. That's what had caused such an immediate reaction. His first thought wasn't anything supernatural. His first thought was that somebody had broken into the house. A squatter. A burglar. Someone dangerous. Something real. That's why he reacted so aggressively. That's why he immediately jumped up. That's why he started searching the hallway. He genuinely believed there was another person inside the house. The strange thing was that nobody was there. He checked the hallway. He checked the stairs. He checked nearby rooms. Nothing. No intruder. No stranger. No explanation. Just an empty house. The more I thought about it, the stranger it became. If it had been me seeing something, I probably would have dismissed it as imagination. Kids misinterpret things all the time. Shadows can look like people. Your mind can play tricks on you. But this wasn't me. This was my dad. A grown man. A practical person. Someone whose immediate reaction was to assume a break-in rather than anything paranormal. And yet he remained convinced that he had seen someone. Years have passed since then. I've spent a lot of time thinking about possible explanations. Maybe the lighting created an illusion. Maybe a shadow happened to resemble a person for a split second. Maybe his eyes briefly misinterpreted something in his peripheral vision. All of those possibilities make sense. They're probably even likely. But what has always stayed with me is the intensity of his reaction. He wasn't mildly startled. He wasn't confused. He was completely convinced that another human being was standing in the doorway. That certainty is what makes the story memorable. Eventually, my family moved out of that house. I was relieved when we left, not because I believed the house was haunted, but because it always seemed to carry a strange atmosphere. Maybe it was simply because of its age. Maybe it was because of the stories surrounding it. Or maybe it was because of moments like that night in the living room. To this day, I still don't know what my dad saw. Neither does he. There was no evidence of anyone being inside the house. No signs of a break-in. No explanation waiting around the corner. Just a brief glimpse of what appeared to be a person standing in the hallway. A person who vanished before anyone could find them. Whenever I think back to that old house, that's the memory that always comes to mind. Not the creaking floors, not the stories about someone dying there years earlier, not even the age of the building itself. What I remember most is sitting on the couch beside my dad, watching television on an otherwise ordinary evening, and seeing him suddenly leap to his feet with a look of genuine fear on his face. Because whatever he saw standing in that doorway, for at least a few seconds, he believed it was absolutely real. And after all these years, neither of us has ever been able to explain why. This happened when I was 15 years old, right at the end of my freshman year of high school. Summer break had just started, and like most teenagers, my friends and I spent nearly every day together. Looking back now, years later, it's still one of the strangest and most disturbing experiences I've ever had. Even today, whenever the subject comes up. The few people who were there usually change the conversation after a minute or two. Nobody likes talking about it for very long. At the time, there were three of us. My friend Kyle, our other friend Michael, and me. Back then, we all lived in Florida. Things are different now. I eventually moved to New York. Kyle still lives somewhere in Florida, as far as I know, although he moved away from the neighborhood where this happened. Michael and I gradually lost touch over the years. I honestly don't know where he is anymore. But despite how much time has passed, all three of us shared one night that none of us ever forgot. Kyle lived in a neighborhood packed with houses, rows and rows of them. The kind of suburban development where every street seemed to look the same and houses stretched in every direction. There were enough homes around that you never felt isolated during the daytime. At night, though, the place felt completely different, especially after midnight. On this particular Friday during summer break, I was spending the night at Kyle's house. Michael was there too. Like most teenage boys, we had absolutely no intention of sleeping anytime soon. We were sitting in Kyle's room playing Halo, talking trash, eating junk food, and generally being loud enough that we probably should have been yelled at hours earlier. It was around 2 in the morning when everything changed. At first, we heard a sound from outside. A scream. At least that's what it sounded like. The noise was so sudden and so loud that all three of us stopped talking immediately. It wasn't an animal sound that any of us recognized. It wasn't a dog. It wasn't a cat. It wasn't anything we'd ever heard before. The closest comparison I can make is that it sounded like a person being murdered. A raw, horrifying scream that echoed through the neighborhood. For several seconds, nobody said anything. The room became completely silent. Michael grabbed the remote and muted the television. Then he looked at us and asked the question we were all thinking. What the hell was that? Kyle tried to act calm. At first, anyway, he shrugged and said it was probably just a fox. The problem was that none of us believed him. Not even Kyle. I could tell by the look on his face. He was nervous, trying to sound confident, trying to convince himself as much as us. Then the scream came again. This time it was much louder, much closer. The sound seemed to come from somewhere directly outside the house. Every hair on my arm stood up. Something about the noise felt wrong. Not unusual. Wrong. It didn't sound natural. It sounded almost artificial, like something trying to imitate a human scream without fully understanding what a scream should sound like. The second scream lasted only a few seconds. Then silence returned. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Kyle finally stood up and walked toward the window. The room was dark except for the television screen. We watched him carefully pull the curtain aside and look outside. Nothing. At least that's what he said. But almost immediately after he looked out the window, we heard another sound. Footsteps. Heavy footsteps. Running, not jogging. Not walking. Running, the strange part was how loud they were. Every step sounded like someone stomping the ground as hard as possible. Boom, 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 boom. The footsteps circled somewhere outside the house before suddenly stopping. Kyle immediately let the curtain fall back into place. Then he locked the window. I remember how strange that felt. Kyle wasn't the type to scare easily. Yet he looked genuinely uncomfortable. We started throwing theories back and forth. Maybe it was somebody playing a prank. Maybe it was neighborhood kids. Maybe it was an animal making weird noises. None of the explanations felt convincing. Then Michael stood up. Without saying anything, he walked over and opened the curtain again. He stared outside for several seconds. Then he spoke. And the moment he did, my stomach dropped. There's somebody watching us. For a second, I thought he was joking. Then I saw his face. He wasn't joking. Not even a little. Kyle and I rushed over. Looking through the window, we saw a figure standing outside. At first, I thought it was just some random person. But the longer I looked, the more uncomfortable I became. The figure was standing near Kyle's father's truck. It appeared to be trying to get into the vehicle. The moment it noticed us watching, it stopped moving. Then, it slowly turned toward the house. That's when it screamed again. This time, the sound was unmistakably different. Instead of sounding like an animal, it sounded like a woman screaming for help. The sound was so realistic that it sent a chill straight through me. I remember thinking that if someone had played me a recording of that scream, I would have believed it came from a terrified woman. Yet, something still felt off. The figure itself looked wrong. It was tall, very tall, and unusually thin. Its posture seemed unnatural. Its arms hung lower than they should have, almost as if they were too long for its body. The way it stood wasn't relaxed. It looked rigid, deliberate, like someone attempting to imitate a person. For several seconds, none of us moved. We simply stared. Then the figure slowly turned its head toward the garage. The movement looked strange, almost mechanical. Then it turned back toward us and smiled. Even now, writing that sentence makes me uncomfortable, because although the darkness prevented us from seeing every detail clearly, there was no mistaking the expression. The thing was smiling, a wide, unnatural grin. Michael immediately backed away from the window. He started panicking. Honestly, so did the rest of us. The situation had gone from creepy to terrifying in a matter of seconds. Michael insisted that we wake Kyle's parents. Before we could do that, though, he grabbed a flashlight from Kyle's desk. He switched it on and pointed it directly at the figure. The beam illuminated its face, and that's when we saw something I'll never forget. Its mouth was covered in blood. 2 front teeth were missing, yet somehow it continued smiling. The sight hit me like a punch to the chest. Everything about it felt wrong. The face, the expression, the blood, the missing teeth. I had never seen anything like it before. The second the flashlight hit it, the figure moved. Not walked, not ran. Moved, it sprinted. In an instant, it disappeared into the darkness beyond the backyard. Then, another sound reached us. Barking, loud barking. At first, that shouldn't have been strange, except for one detail. Kyle's dog, Buster, was asleep right beside us. The barking wasn't coming from him. It was coming from outside, somewhere in the darkness. At that point, all 3 of us completely lost it. We were yelling loud enough that Kyle's father finally burst into the room. The moment he saw how terrified we were, he demanded to know what happened. Michael tried explaining. The screams, the figure, the truck, the flashlight. Everything, as he spoke, I watched Kyle's father's face change. The color seemed to drain from it. Without saying much, he immediately left the room. A minute later, he returned carrying a shotgun and a flashlight. That alone scared me more than anything else, because adults don't usually grab shotguns unless they think something serious is happening. He stepped outside while we watched from the window. Looking back, we probably should have stayed away from the glass. Instead, we stood there, staring into the darkness like complete idiots. For several minutes, he searched the property. The flashlight beam moved across the yard, around the truck, toward the fence, into the trees. Nothing. Eventually, he returned. The expression on his face was impossible to read. Kyle immediately asked if he found anything. His father paused for several seconds before answering. Probably foxes or some neighborhood kids messing around. Nobody believed him. Not even him, because the second he came back inside, he locked every door in the house. Every single one. Normally, he never did that. That night, nobody slept. We sat awake until sunrise. Every noise made us jump. Every shadow made us nervous. Morning finally arrived. With daylight came a little confidence. We decided to go outside and see if there was any evidence of what happened. Part of me expected to find nothing. Part of me hoped we'd find nothing. Instead, we discovered something beside the truck. Teeth. 2 bloody, human-looking teeth. Lying on the ground. Exactly where the figure had been standing. Nobody said much. Kyle's father picked them up using a plastic bag. Then he threw the bag into a trash bin behind the house. The entire thing felt surreal. Over the following weeks, life gradually returned to normal, at least on the surface. Then, Kyle told me something that made everything worse. Apparently, his father eventually admitted that he had heard those screams before. Not once, not twice, for years. According to him, strange screaming noises occasionally occurred throughout that specific neighborhood. Nobody seemed to know what caused them. Nobody seemed able to explain them. After hearing that, I never spent another night at Kyle's house. Not once. Years passed. Kyle eventually moved away. Michael slowly disappeared from our social circle. Life moved on. For a while, I convinced myself the entire thing was just a bizarre experience we'd never fully understand. Then, something happened that shattered that illusion. Months later, both Kyle and I received envelopes in the mail. Neither of us recognized the sender. Neither of us expected anything unusual. Inside each envelope was the same thing: 2 teeth. No note, no explanation. Just 2 teeth. To this day, I don't know who sent them. I don't know where they came from. And I don't know what we saw outside that window. Maybe there are rational explanations for parts of the story. Maybe there are explanations for all of it. But after all these years, one thing remains certain. Whenever I think back to that summer night in Florida, I can still hear that scream echoing through the darkness. And I still remember the grin staring back at us through the window. I should probably start by saying that this isn't my dad's story or my brother's story. If either of them happen to use this account, this experience belongs to me. I'm a teenage girl, and for as long as I can remember, strange things have happened around me. Whether people believe me or not is another story entirely. Most of the time, when I tell someone about these experiences, they either laugh, come up with a logical explanation, or assume I'm exaggerating. I've gotten used to that. After a while, you stop trying to convince people and simply accept that not everyone sees the world the same way. I'm pagan, and my beliefs have definitely influenced the way I view certain experiences. Sometimes that's a good thing. It makes me feel connected to the world around me in ways that are difficult to explain. Other times, though, it can be unsettling. There have been moments throughout my life when I've felt things I couldn't explain, sensed presences that didn't seem visible to anyone else, or walked into places that carried an atmosphere so heavy it felt almost physical. One feeling in particular has followed me for most of my life. No matter where I go, I often feel like I'm not entirely alone. It's not necessarily a frightening feeling. In fact, most of the time it's subtle. It's more like a constant awareness in the back of my mind, as if someone is standing just outside my field of vision. Not close enough to touch, not close enough to see, but always there. I've learned to live with it. Most days, I barely think about it anymore. But there was one experience that brought that feeling rushing back stronger than ever. I was 12 years old when it happened. Every year, my family takes a trip to South Carolina to visit relatives on my mom's side of the family. It's a tradition we've had for years. We spend time with my aunt and uncle, catch up with family members, and visit different historical sites around the area. One year during that trip, someone suggested we go on a ghost tour. At first, I thought it sounded fun. I love history, old stories, local legends, and anything remotely spooky. A ghost tour seemed like the perfect combination of all those things. So one evening, my family joined a tour group and headed out. The location itself was beautiful in a dark and eerie sort of way. Much of the tour took place around an old cemetery and nearby historic areas. The air felt heavy with humidity, and the fading daylight cast long shadows across the graves. Ancient trees stretched overhead, their branches twisting across the sky like skeletal fingers. The tour guide was enthusiastic, very enthusiastic. In fact, he talked almost nonstop. He told stories about local legends, unexplained sightings, tragic deaths, haunted locations, and old folklore. At one point, he spent quite a while talking about creatures known as boo hags, which are part of local southern folklore. My mom, who has never been a fan of scary things, looked nervous for most of the tour. That only made the experience more entertaining. There were also a few tourists who seemed determined to act tough, while secretly scaring themselves with every story. Overall, it was exactly what I expected. A fun evening filled with creepy stories and historical facts. At least, that's how it started. As the tour continued, I began noticing something strange. The atmosphere felt different from what I expected. I visited old places before, I visited cemeteries before, but this felt heavier. It felt crowded. Not physically crowded with people. Something else. The best way I can describe it is that the location seemed full of emotional energy. Everywhere I looked, I felt layers of history. Grief, anger, sadness, loss, the cemetery didn't feel empty. It felt occupied, not by visible people, but by the memories and emotions attached to the place. I know some people will say that's just imagination. Maybe they're right. But that feeling stayed with me throughout the entire tour. I kept finding myself looking over my shoulder, not because I thought something was going to jump out at me, but because I constantly felt like there was another presence nearby. Watching, listening, observing, throughout the evening, I took pictures with my phone. Lots of pictures. The gravestones, the pathways, the old trees, various landmarks the guide pointed out. I wasn't specifically trying to capture anything paranormal. I simply wanted memories of the trip. By the time the tour ended, I had almost forgotten about the strange feeling altogether. My family returned to my aunt and uncle's house later that night. Everyone was tired. The adults settled in for the evening, while I headed to the room where I would be sleeping. I wasn't ready for bed yet. Instead, I grabbed a new manga I had recently started reading. It was a book by Junji Ito, whose stories are famous for being disturbing, unsettling, and deeply creepy. In hindsight, reading horror stories immediately after a ghost tour was probably not the smartest idea. Still, I spent a while reading before eventually setting the book aside. That's when I decided to look through the photos I had taken. At first, everything seemed normal. Picture after picture showed exactly what I remembered seeing. Old gravestones, trees, dark pathways, historic monuments. Nothing unusual. Then, I stopped on one image. Something about it felt wrong. I couldn't immediately explain why. The photo looked normal at first glance, yet my eyes kept returning to one specific area. There was something there, or at least I thought there might be. Curious, I opened the photo editing tools on my phone. I increased the brightness, then adjusted the contrast. The image slowly became clearer, and that's when I saw it. Behind one of the gravestones stood a figure. For a few seconds, I genuinely thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. I zoomed in. The figure remained. My heart immediately started pounding. It appeared unusually tall, far taller than anyone else visible in the image. Its body was partially hidden behind the gravestone, but enough was visible to make out a distinct shape. What unsettled me most was the face. The skin appeared unnaturally pale. The eye sockets looked dark and hollow. Not empty exactly, just black, like deep shadows where eyes should have been. Its mouth seemed stretched into an impossibly wide expression. The longer I looked at it, the more uncomfortable I became. The figure reminded me of one of those unsettling internet horror creations. Something that looked almost human, but not quite. Something designed specifically to trigger discomfort. I stared at the image far longer than I should have. Part of me wanted to close it. Another part couldn't stop looking. I kept zooming in and out, checking different angles, trying to determine whether it was simply a trick of light and shadow. The problem was that no matter how many times I looked, I couldn't unsee it. Once I noticed the figure, it became impossible to ignore. My imagination immediately began filling in the blanks. What if it had been standing there the entire time? What if it had been watching the tour group? What if it had been watching me? The rational side of my brain tried to fight back. Maybe it was a person. Maybe it was a strange angle. Maybe the shadows and lighting created an illusion. Photographs are famous for producing misleading images. Faces appear in reflections. Human shapes emerge from random patterns. Our brains naturally try to identify recognizable forms. I knew all of that. Yet none of those explanations stopped me from feeling terrified. The feeling I had experienced during the tour suddenly returned. That awareness, that sensation of being observed. Only now it felt stronger. The image sat on my phone screen like proof of something I couldn't explain. I remember turning off the lights and trying to sleep. It didn't work. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured the figure standing behind the gravestone. Silent, watching, waiting, the room suddenly felt too quiet. Every creak of the house seemed louder than normal. Every shadow appeared darker. Hours passed. I checked the photo again more times than I can count. Part of me hoped the figure would somehow disappear. Of course, it never did. I don't think I slept at all that night. Whenever I started drifting off, the image would return to my mind. The pale face, the dark eye sockets, the unnatural smile, and the feeling that whatever it was had been standing there the entire time while we walked through the cemetery. Years have passed since that trip. I've grown older. I've become more skeptical about certain things and more open-minded about others. I've learned that photographs can be deceptive. I've learned that fear can influence perception. I've learned that sometimes our minds create patterns where none exist. Yet despite knowing all of that, I still think about that picture. Not every day. Not even every month. But every now and then, the memory returns. I remember sitting on the edge of my bed in my aunt and uncle's house, staring at my phone screen in the middle of the night. I remember the chill that ran through me when I brightened the image, and I remember the overwhelming feeling that something had been there with us in that cemetery. Whether it was a trick of the light, a strange coincidence, or something I'll never fully understand, I honestly can't say. All I know is that I walked into that ghost tour expecting nothing more than a few creepy stories. Instead, I came home with a photograph that still unsettles me years later. And sometimes, when I think about that pale figure standing behind the gravestone, I find myself wondering the same thing I wondered that night. If something really was there, how long had it been watching us before I noticed it? One of the creepiest memories from my childhood revolves around a doll that I never wanted and never trusted. Even though I was very young when it happened, I can still remember certain details about it with surprising clarity. I was younger than 9 years old at the time. I don't remember exactly how old I was, but I know I was still a little kid. I also can't remember whether it was my dad or my uncle who gave me the doll. The memory is fuzzy after all these years, but one thing I remember perfectly is how much I hated it. The moment I saw it, something about it made me uncomfortable. It wasn't one of those small dolls that children carry around or place on a shelf. This thing was huge. If I had to guess, it was somewhere between 3 and 4 feet tall. At the time, I was still taller than it, but not by much. To a young child, it felt enormous. The doll had long blonde hair that hung down around its shoulders. Its eyes were bright blue and seemed strangely lifelike whenever I looked at them. I also remember that it wasn't wearing any clothes when I first got it. I know that sounds odd, but that's one of the details that stuck in my mind. Most kids would probably have been excited to receive such a large doll. I wasn't. I absolutely hated it. I couldn't explain why. It never did anything when I first got it. It just sat there. Yet every time I looked at it, I felt uneasy. It wasn't the kind of fear that comes from seeing a monster in a movie. It was more like a constant feeling that something wasn't right about it. The doll made me uncomfortable simply by existing. Because of that, I tried keeping it out of sight whenever possible. At first, I stored it in my closet. I figured that if I couldn't see it, I wouldn't have to think about it. The closet seemed like the perfect place. I laid the doll down flat and piled some clothes over it. My thinking was simple. If it was buried beneath a bunch of clothing, I wouldn't have to look at those blue eyes staring at me anymore. For a while, everything seemed fine. Then I started noticing something strange. Whenever I checked on it, the doll seemed different. At first, I convinced myself I was imagining things. Maybe I forgot exactly how I had left it. Maybe I moved it without remembering. Maybe some of the clothes had shifted. But the longer it continued, the harder it became to ignore. The doll's arms appeared to be moving. Not suddenly, not dramatically, very slowly, almost as if they were changing position over time. I would leave the doll lying flat. Then later, when I looked again, one of its arms would be raised slightly higher than before. At first, I assumed there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe the clothes were shifting. Maybe the doll's joints were loose. Maybe gravity was causing parts of it to move. Still, seeing it happen repeatedly made me uncomfortable. Every time I checked the closet, I found myself wondering if the doll would be in a different position. And often it was. Eventually, I decided I didn't want it in my closet anymore. If I couldn't stop thinking about it, I figured maybe a different location would help. So I moved it underneath my bed. At first, that seemed like a better solution. The doll was completely hidden, out of sight, out of mind. Or at least that was the plan. For a while, things seemed normal. Then the noises started. The first time I heard it, I wasn't even sure what had happened. Late one night, while lying in bed, I heard a faint sound beneath me. Tap. I sat up and listened. Nothing. After a few moments, I convinced myself it was probably the house settling or some other harmless noise. Then it happened again. Tap. This time I knew the sound had come from underneath the bed. I remember pulling my blanket a little higher and staring into the darkness. I didn't want to look underneath. I definitely didn't want to see the doll. The sound stopped, and eventually I fell asleep. But over time, it happened again. And again. The knocking always seemed to come from beneath the bed. A soft tapping against the wooden frame, not loud enough to wake the entire house. Just loud enough to make me aware of it. Just loud enough to make me wonder. As a child, my imagination was already active enough without something like that happening. Every noise became suspicious. Every creak of the floorboards made me nervous. And every time I heard knocking beneath the bed, my thoughts immediately went to the doll. Part of me wanted to pull it out and get rid of it. Another part of me wanted absolutely nothing to do with it. So instead, I ignored it as best I could. The strange thing is that I don't remember what eventually happened to the doll. For something that scared me so much, you would think I would remember the day it disappeared. But I don't. There isn't a clear memory of throwing it away. There isn't a memory of giving it away. There isn't even a memory of talking about it with my parents. One day, it was simply gone. I've tried to remember what happened, but the details never come back. The only explanation I can think of is that my mom eventually got rid of it. Maybe she noticed how much I disliked it. Maybe she donated it. Maybe she threw it away. Maybe she moved it somewhere and forgot to tell me. I honestly don't know. What I do know is that I never saw it again. Looking back now as an adult, I can think of several possible explanations. The moving arms may have been caused by loose joints or the way the doll was positioned. The knocking sounds could have come from the bed frame expanding and contracting, pipes inside the walls, or any number of ordinary household noises. Children also tend to remember events differently than adults. Fear has a way of making memories feel larger and stranger over time. All of those explanations make sense. And yet, whenever I think about that doll, I still get the same uneasy feeling I had as a child. Maybe it was simply an ordinary toy that my imagination transformed into something frightening. Maybe there was nothing unusual about it at all. But even now, years later, I can still picture it clearly. The long blonde hair, the bright blue eyes, the oversized body lying hidden beneath piles of clothes, and the soft knocking sounds that seemed to come from under my bed in the middle of the night. Whatever the truth was, it remains one of the strangest memories of my childhood. And to this day, I don't miss that doll one bit. I'm the oldest child in my family, and I'm 20 years old now. My younger brother was born in 2009, which makes him 16. On the surface, we're a pretty normal family. We argue, joke around, go on vacations, celebrate birthdays, and spend time together like everyone else. But there's one story that has followed us for most of our lives. A story that none of us can fully explain. It begins before my brother was ever born. A few years before his birth, my mom went through several pregnancies that ended in miscarriage. According to doctors, there were medical reasons behind many of the complications. My mother has A-negative blood, while my father has O-positive blood, which created difficulties during pregnancy. She was also still relatively young, in her late 20s, and the repeated losses took a significant emotional toll on her. Most of the miscarriages happened early in the pregnancies. As painful as they were, they occurred before the babies had fully developed. Then came the final pregnancy before my brother. Everything seemed to be going well. The pregnancy had progressed much further than the others. My parents were hopeful. Family members were excited. Plans were already being made. Then tragedy struck. During the 7th month of the pregnancy, my mother lost the baby. It was a boy. Unlike the earlier miscarriages, this loss was different. The baby had developed enough that my mother was able to see him after delivery. She has rarely spoken about that day in detail, but it's obvious even now that it changed her forever. Not long afterward, she became pregnant again. That pregnancy resulted in my younger brother. From the outside, it looked like our family had finally received the happy ending it desperately needed. But according to my mother, something else began happening around that time. She says that after my brother was born, she occasionally heard a baby crying. At first, she assumed it was my brother. That's a perfectly normal assumption for a new mother. But there were moments when she would hear the crying and discover that my brother was asleep. Mom would later tell us that the cries sounded different. Not dramatically different. Just different enough that she felt certain they weren't coming from him. The experiences became so vivid that she sometimes began lactating after hearing them, even when my brother wasn't crying. She never forgot the baby she lost, and over time she became convinced that the crying belonged to him. Most people would probably dismiss those experiences as grief. And honestly, that's what I thought for many years. Losing a child, especially that late into a pregnancy, is an unimaginable trauma. It makes sense that memories, emotions, and even sensory experiences might linger for years afterward. The strange thing is that the experiences never seem to stop. As my brother grew older, my mother would occasionally mention seeing the child. Not constantly, not every day, but often enough that it became part of family conversations. She always described him similarly. A boy, quiet, watching, present, never threatening, never aggressive, just there. What made the story harder to dismiss was that eventually my brother and I began experiencing things ourselves. Now, I should probably mention that neither of us are particularly religious. We're not the type of people who immediately jump to supernatural explanations. In fact, most of the time we try to find logical reasons for strange events. Yet there have been moments that left us genuinely puzzled. One of my mother's theories developed over the years. According to her, the child appears more often whenever the family is especially happy, whenever we're celebrating, whenever we're spending quality time together, whenever gifts are being bought for my brother or me. She jokingly refers to it as middle child syndrome. In her mind, the lost child feels left out, as if he's watching the family continue without him and occasionally reminding us that he's still there. It's a strange theory. But after hearing it for years, we've all become familiar with it. One example involves our terrace. Our apartment sits directly below it. Many evenings, especially when the weather is nice, strange sounds come from up there. The sounds often resemble someone running around. Sometimes it sounds like a ball bouncing. Other times it sounds like someone playing. The strange part is that nobody is usually up there. One day, one of our neighbors approached my mother with an odd question. He said he had seen her son playing with a ball on the terrace. Apparently, the ball had rolled onto his side, and he wanted to return it. The problem was that my brother hadn't played on the terrace for years. At first, everyone assumed it was a misunderstanding. Maybe the neighbor had mistaken another child for my brother. Maybe he simply got confused. But the story stuck with us. Then there was another incident. My mother was sitting in her room one evening when she heard the unmistakable sound of a ball bouncing in the hallway outside her bedroom, over and over again. Bounce, roll, footsteps, bounce, as though someone was repeatedly throwing and retrieving a ball. She got up to investigate. The hallway was empty. Meanwhile, my brother was asleep. There was nobody there. Stories like that became surprisingly common in our household. Nothing dramatic, nothing terrifying, just enough odd occurrences to keep the mystery alive. One experience in particular still stands out to me. A few years ago, during summer break, my brother and I were hanging out in the living room late at night. It was probably around 2 in the morning. Neither of us felt tired, so we stayed up watching movies. For whatever reason, we were having an unusually good time. We were laughing constantly, making jokes, and genuinely enjoying each other's company. Anyone with siblings knows those moments are rare enough to be memorable. At some point, I placed my earbuds case on the sofa beside me. My brother saw me do it. I remember it clearly because we were discussing something on the movie when I set it down. A few minutes later, the case was gone. Completely gone. At first, we assumed it had fallen between the cushions. No big deal. That happens all the time. We checked. Nothing. Then we searched the floor. Nothing. Then we searched nearby tables. Nothing. As the minutes passed, the situation became strangely frustrating. Both of us knew exactly where the case had been. Yet it had vanished. Eventually, we searched the entire room. Then the entire house. Drawers, shelves, counters, bedrooms, everywhere. Hours passed. Our parents got involved. Everyone searched. Nobody found anything. By that point, the situation had become absurd. Then, we gave up. Tired and annoyed, we returned to the living room. And there it was, sitting neatly on the sofa. Not hidden, not partially visible, not tucked away. It was sitting in plain sight. Anyone entering the room could have seen it immediately. The placement was so obvious that there was no way we could have missed it earlier. The moment my brother and I saw it, we exchanged a look. Neither of us said anything. But we were thinking the same thing. Somehow, the disappearance felt connected to all those other strange experiences. Rationally, there were probably explanations. Maybe we overlooked it. Maybe someone moved it without realizing. Maybe exhaustion affected our memory. Yet, neither of us truly believed those explanations. The feeling was impossible to shake. Now that I'm back home from college for the summer, the experiences seem to have increased again. Our family is preparing for a large vacation. Everyone is spending more time together. We're shopping, making plans, buying gifts, and generally enjoying being together. According to my mother's theory, that should mean more activity. And strangely enough, it does seem to coincide. Lately, I've started noticing something from the corner of my eye. A tall figure, thin, lanky, always moving, never standing still long enough for me to focus on it. The moment I turn my head, it's gone. If someone else told me that story, I'd probably assume they were seeing shadows or experiencing peripheral vision tricks. Maybe that's exactly what's happening. But what surprises me most is that I never feel afraid. Not once. The figure doesn't scare me. Neither do the sounds. Neither do the stories. My mother feels the same way. Whenever she talks about the child, there is sadness in her voice, but never fear. She has always insisted that he means no harm. The only thing she occasionally points to is my brother's mysterious fevers. Every now and then, after periods where the family is showering my brother with attention, he'll come down with a mild fever. Nothing serious. Nothing dangerous. By the next morning, he's usually fine. My mother jokingly blames the lost child. According to her, it's jealousy. A reminder that he wants attention too. Personally, I'm not convinced that's what's happening. People get sick. Fevers happen. Coincidences happen. Still, after years of hearing the stories and experiencing strange moments myself, I understand why she thinks that way. The question that keeps coming back to me is this. If what we're experiencing really is connected to the child my mother lost all those years ago, why does he seem older now? The figure she originally described was a baby. The presence I occasionally notice feels much older, taller, more mature. It's almost as if the image has aged alongside the rest of us. I don't know whether that's meaningful or simply the result of our minds adapting over time. Maybe grief evolves. Maybe memories grow and change as we do. Maybe the stories we've told ourselves for years have taken on a life of their own. Or maybe there truly is something we don't understand. Whatever the explanation, the presence has become a strange part of our family history. It isn't something we talk about every day. It isn't something that dominates our lives. It's simply there. Like an old story passed down through generations. A story about a child who never got the chance to grow up, yet somehow never completely left. Whether that's grief, memory, coincidence, or something else entirely, I honestly don't know. But after all these years, one thing remains true. Whenever strange things happen in our house, nobody asks who it was anymore. We all already know the answer we're thinking of, and somehow, none of us are afraid of it. This happened when I was 14 years old. I'm 15 now, and even though it was only about a year ago, I still think about it sometimes. It remains one of the strangest and most unsettling experiences I've ever had. Last summer, my mom, my two brothers, and I traveled to Mexico to stay with my aunt and uncle for a while. It was supposed to be a fun summer visit, a chance to spend time with family and enjoy being somewhere different for a few months. My aunt was very interested in spiritual practices and things that I never really understood. She had all kinds of decorations around the house, including dolls, religious items, spiritual objects, and other things that honestly made me a little uncomfortable. I never paid much attention to them during the day, but at night they definitely made the house feel different. For most of the summer, everything was normal. Then, one night, something happened that I still can't explain. We had been out for the evening and returned home fairly late. As usual, everyone started unloading things from the car. My uncle had bought some beer, and I was helping carry it from the trunk into the house. The driveway sat near an old abandoned property. Behind me was a rundown house that looked like it had been empty for years. Parts of it appeared broken, and large, overgrown bushes surrounded much of the property. During the daytime, it looked creepy enough. But at night, it was even worse. The darkness seemed to swallow the entire place. Because of the bushes, it was impossible to see clearly into the yard or around the structure. As I was carrying things from the trunk, I suddenly got the feeling that someone was standing behind me. It wasn't a sound, it wasn't movement, just a feeling. The kind that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. At first, I assumed it was one of my cousins trying to scare me. Without really thinking about it, I turned around. The moment I did, my stomach dropped. Standing near the edge of the darkness was a woman. At least, it looked like a woman. Everything about her was black. Her clothing was black. Her skin appeared black. The darkness seemed to cling to her in a way that made it difficult to see where her body ended and the night began. But what terrified me most was her face, or rather, the lack of one. I couldn't make out any facial features at all. No eyes, no nose, no mouth, nothing, just a blank, dark surface where a face should have been. For a second, I completely froze. I couldn't process what I was looking at. Every instinct in my body told me that something was wrong. I immediately turned toward my mom and tapped her shoulder. I told her to look. The entire encounter couldn't have lasted more than a few seconds. When she turned around, the figure was gone. There was nobody standing there. At first, I wondered if I had somehow imagined it. Then my mom pointed toward the bushes. They were moving, not gently swaying from the wind, moving quickly, as if something had just rushed through them. I remember staring at the bushes while trying to convince myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe it was a person. Maybe it was someone hiding near the abandoned house. Maybe the darkness had distorted what I saw. Whatever the explanation was, I couldn't shake the fear that had settled inside me. Once everything was brought inside, my aunt noticed that I looked shaken. When I explained what happened, she didn't seem surprised. Instead, she started telling me to eat some ginger. I never fully understood why. Maybe it was part of a spiritual belief she had. Maybe she thought it would help calm me down. Whatever the reason, she seemed convinced it would help. The rest of the family eventually settled down for the night. I tried my best to forget about what I had seen. At first, I thought I was succeeding. Later that night, I was lying on my cousin's bed, scrolling through my phone. The room was quiet. Everyone else was busy elsewhere in the house. For a while, everything seemed normal. Then I looked up. On top of the closet sat several dolls. During the day, they had looked harmless enough. At night, they felt completely different. At first, I tried ignoring them. But I couldn't shake the feeling that they were looking directly at me. Not in the normal way dolls seem to stare because of how their eyes are painted. This felt different. It felt intentional, as if something was behind those eyes, watching, following my movements. The more I looked at them, the more uncomfortable I became. I tried convincing myself that my imagination was getting the better of me. After all, I was already frightened because of what had happened outside. Maybe I was just being paranoid. Then, something moved. One of the dolls seemed to shift slightly. I blinked. For a moment, I wondered if I had imagined it. Then, another movement caught my attention. Something near the closet shook. Not dramatically, just enough to make me notice. That was enough for me. Whatever confidence I had left disappeared instantly. I jumped off the bed, grabbed my phone, and left the room. I didn't stop until I reached my mom. I remember sitting beside her and refusing to go back into the room for a while. Part of me felt embarrassed. Another part of me was genuinely terrified. The strange thing is that nothing else happened after that. There were no more sightings, no more moving dolls, no more faceless figures near the abandoned house. The rest of the summer passed normally. Eventually, the trip ended and we returned home. Life went back to normal. Even now, when I think about that summer, I still wonder what I actually saw that night. Maybe the darkness and shadows played tricks on my eyes. Maybe there really was someone near the abandoned house. Maybe being in an unfamiliar place made me more anxious than usual. As for the dolls, maybe fear and exhaustion made ordinary objects seem threatening. Those explanations make sense. But what has stayed with me isn't necessarily what I saw. It's how real it felt in the moment. The image of that faceless woman standing in the darkness remains clear in my memory. So does the feeling of looking up at those dolls and being absolutely convinced they were staring back at me. Whether there was a logical explanation or not, it was one of those experiences that leaves a lasting impression. A year later, I still haven't forgotten it. And honestly, I don't think I ever will. This happened when I was around 17 years old, and even though it was a relatively short experience, it scared me enough that it completely changed my nightly routine for months afterward. At the time, my dad and I had our computers set up in his home office. It wasn't a huge room, but it was comfortable enough to spend hours gaming or browsing online. We both used the space regularly, and I often stayed up much later than I probably should have. One night, I was sitting at my computer playing Mortal Kombat X. It was late, really late. I remember checking the clock at some point and seeing that it was around 1 in the morning. The entire house was quiet. My dad had already gone to bed, and everyone else was asleep. The only sounds in the room were the game, the hum of the computer fans, and the occasional click of my keyboard. My computer case had a large glass side panel. If you've ever owned a gaming PC with a transparent side, you know how reflective they can be at night. The lights from inside the computer often bounce off the glass, creating reflections of whatever is around you. I wasn't thinking about any of that at the time. I was focused on the game. Then something caught my attention. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a reflection on the glass panel. At first, I didn't think much about it. Reflections are normal. But something about it felt wrong. The reflection from the glass seemed to line up with the window across the room. Without really understanding why, I glanced toward it. That's when I saw what looked like a person standing in the window. The moment my eyes landed on it, every ounce of focus I had on the game disappeared. I froze. For a second, I simply stared. The figure appeared human. At least, that's what my brain immediately registered. Someone standing there, watching, looking in through the window. To this day, I can't say exactly what I saw. The image lasted only a moment. Maybe it was a reflection. Maybe it was a shadow. Maybe it was something completely ordinary that my tired brain interpreted as a person. But in that moment, it felt absolutely real. My heart immediately started racing. I remember staring for another second, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Then, survival instincts took over. I got out of that chair faster than I ever thought possible. I practically launched myself across the room. Within seconds, I was running down the hallway toward my dad's bedroom. I woke him up and told him that I thought someone was outside the window. To his credit, he didn't dismiss me. Even though it was 1 in the morning, he got up immediately and went to investigate. I stayed inside while he checked around the house. Those few minutes felt much longer. I kept expecting him to come back and confirm that somebody had been out there. Instead, he returned and told me there was nobody outside. He checked around the yard. He looked near the windows. He searched the areas where someone could have hidden. Nothing, no footprints, no movement, no sign that anyone had been there at all. That should have made me feel better. Honestly, it didn't. Part of me was relieved, of course. The last thing I wanted was an actual stranger lurking outside the house. But another part of me couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen. If nobody was there, then what exactly had I been looking at? The image kept replaying in my mind. The shape, the outline, the feeling that someone had been staring back at me. For the rest of that night, I barely slept. Every small sound made me alert. Every shadow seemed suspicious. And even though my dad assured me everything was fine, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been outside that window. Over the following weeks, the experience stayed with me. Actually, it affected me more than I expected. Normally, I loved staying up late, playing games. Late-night gaming sessions were one of my favorite ways to relax. After that night, though, I wanted nothing to do with being awake at 1 in the morning. For the next month or two, I started going to bed ridiculously early. 9 o'clock became my new bedtime, sometimes even earlier. The thought of sitting alone in that office late at night made me uncomfortable. Every time I entered the room after dark, I found myself glancing toward the window. Every reflection caught my attention. Every movement outside made me pause. Eventually, the fear faded. Life returned to normal. I started staying up later again. The office became just another room. Nothing strange ever happened there afterward. Yet even now, years later, I still remember that moment clearly. It wasn't the possibility of a ghost or anything supernatural that scared me. It was the possibility that someone might actually have been standing outside my window in the middle of the night. And when my dad found nothing, that somehow made the whole thing even stranger. Maybe it was just a reflection. Maybe the angle of the glass created an illusion. Maybe my tired eyes misinterpreted shadows and shapes. Those explanations make sense. In fact, they're probably the most likely explanations. But no matter how logical the answer might be, I can still remember the exact feeling that hit me when I looked toward that window. That sudden rush of fear, that instant certainty that someone was there, and the way I ran out of that room without thinking twice. I've had plenty of creepy moments in my life since then, but very few have made me react that quickly. Whatever I saw that night, real or imagined, it was convincing enough to make a 17-year-old abandon his game, wake up his dad at 1 in the morning, and start going to bed before 10 for the next 2 months. And honestly, that's probably why I still remember it so clearly. This happened when I was around 17 years old, and even though it was a relatively short experience, it scared me enough that it completely changed my nightly routine for months afterward. At the time, my dad and I had our computers set up in his home office. It wasn't a huge room, but it was comfortable enough to spend hours gaming or browsing online. We both used the space regularly, and I often stayed up much later than I probably should have. One night, I was sitting at my computer playing Mortal Kombat X. It was late, really late. I remember checking the clock at some point and seeing that it was around 1 in the morning. The entire house was quiet. My dad had already gone to bed, and everyone else was asleep. The only sounds in the room were the game, the hum of the computer fans, and the occasional click of my keyboard. My computer case had a large glass side panel. If you've ever owned a gaming PC with a transparent side, you know how reflective they can be at night. The lights from inside the computer often bounce off the glass, creating reflections of whatever is around you. I wasn't thinking about any of that at the time. I was focused on the game. Then something caught my attention. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a reflection on the glass panel. At first, I didn't think much about it. Reflections are normal. But something about it felt wrong. The reflection from the glass seemed to line up with the window across the room. Without really understanding why, I glanced toward it. That's when I saw what looked like a person standing in the window. The moment my eyes landed on it, every ounce of focus I had on the game disappeared. I froze. For a second, I simply stared. The figure appeared human. At least, that's what my brain immediately registered. Someone standing there, watching, looking in through the window. To this day, I can't say exactly what I saw. The image lasted only a moment. Maybe it was a reflection. Maybe it was a shadow. Maybe it was something completely ordinary that my tired brain interpreted as a person. But in that moment, it felt absolutely real. My heart immediately started racing. I remember staring for another second, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Then, survival instincts took over. I got out of that chair faster than I ever thought possible. I practically launched myself across the room. Within seconds, I was running down the hallway toward my dad's bedroom. I woke him up and told him that I thought someone was outside the window. To his credit, he didn't dismiss me. Even though it was 1 a.m, he got up immediately and went to investigate. I stayed inside while he checked around the house. Those few minutes felt much longer. I kept expecting him to come back and confirm that somebody had been out there. Instead, he returned and told me there was nobody outside. He checked around the yard. He looked near the windows. He searched the areas where someone could have hidden. Nothing, no footprints, no movement, no sign that anyone had been there at all. That should have made me feel better. Honestly, it didn't. Part of me was relieved, of course. The last thing I wanted was an actual stranger lurking outside the house. But another part of me couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen. If nobody was there, then what exactly had I been looking at? The image kept replaying in my mind. The shape, the outline, the feeling that someone had been staring back at me. For the rest of that night, I barely slept. Every small sound made me alert. Every shadow seemed suspicious. And even though my dad assured me everything was fine, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been outside that window. Over the following weeks, the experience stayed with me. Actually, it affected me more than I expected. Normally, I loved staying up late, playing games. Late-night gaming sessions were one of my favorite ways to relax. After that night, though, I wanted nothing to do with being awake at 1 a.m. For the next month or two, I started going to bed ridiculously early. 9 o'clock became my new bedtime, sometimes even earlier. The thought of sitting alone in that office late at night made me uncomfortable. Every time I entered the room after dark, I found myself glancing toward the window. Every reflection caught my attention. Every movement outside made me pause. Eventually, the fear faded. Life returned to normal. I started staying up later again. The office became just another room. Nothing strange ever happened there afterward. Yet even now, years later, I still remember that moment clearly. It wasn't the possibility of a ghost or anything supernatural that scared me. It was the possibility that someone might actually have been standing outside my window in the middle of the night. And when my dad found nothing, that somehow made the whole thing even stranger. Maybe it was just a reflection. Maybe the angle of the glass created an illusion. Maybe my tired eyes misinterpreted shadows and shapes. Those explanations make sense. In fact, they're probably the most likely explanations. But no matter how logical the answer might be, I can still remember the exact feeling that hit me when I looked toward that window. That sudden rush of fear, that instant certainty that someone was there, and the way I ran out of that room without thinking twice. I've had plenty of creepy moments in my life since then, but very few have made me react that quickly. Whatever I saw that night, real or imagined, it was convincing enough to make a 17-year-old abandon his game, wake up his dad at 1 in the morning, and start going to bed before 10 for the next 2 months. And honestly, that's probably why I still remember it so clearly.